So thanks for joining this session on cybersecurity, privacy, and blockchain. So there's a lot to cover. And yes, so thanks for joining this session on cybersecurity, privacy, and the blockchain. So there's a lot to cover. So we'll start right away with David Wheeler from the US, from Northern Virginia. So thanks for joining us at this very early time. And please explain to all the audience here what's this very interesting project, Best Practices Badge, which allows to augment, whose goal is to augment the quality and security of all open source projects. So that's a very ambitious goal. You have 20 minutes, minus 2-3 minutes, please, for questions. Floor is yours.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to talk with you all today. I'm so sorry that I can't be there in person. I'm hoping that I will be able to be there in person in not too distant future. So I'm here today to talk about the Core Infrastructure Initiative Best Practices Badge. I would love to hear questions, but because we have such a short time, please hold your questions to the end and come to the microphone so that everyone, including me, can hear you. So I want to first start with just a little history, go back to Heartbleed. In 2014, a vulnerability called Heartbleed was found in the program OpenSSF. And as people examined the issue, it really highlighted the challenge that although there are some really well-run open source software projects, there are some open source software projects which don't always follow widely used or accepted practices, and that results in a lot of, frankly, avoidable problems. I should quickly note, when I say the phrase open source software, I mean software that's licensed to users in a particular way, so it allows them to run it for any purpose, study, modify, freely redistribute copies of the original or modified programs, also referred to in other names such as Libre software. Unsurprisingly, the practices of an open source project matter. It is not true that all open source software is insecure or that all open source is secure. It's also not true that all open source is poor quality or it's all excellent quality. All too often, the word all suggests it's not true. There's going to be exceptions. Now, it's true that open source software has a serious, significant potential advantage. Because open source software can be reviewed by anyone, and they can make comments and critique, it has a substantial potential advantage for something that's called mass peer review, the review of others. But while it has a potential advantage, all of us are aware of projects and individuals that do not live up to their potential. So yes, it has a potential advantage, but that's not always realized. In particular, for purposes of this talk, open source software tends to be more secure and higher quality if it follows good practices, and that would make sense, right? Now, it is true that good people are necessary, but it's insufficient. Good software developers, good document developers make mistakes. It happens. We are all human. Okay? And hopefully both the creators and users of open source software want good results. So that raises some questions. What are these good practices that are going to help hopefully the good people involved develop higher quality software, more secure software? And then once we identify those, how can we encourage projects to follow them, and how can anyone know if they're actually being followed? And this leads us to the CII, or the Core Infrastructure Initiative Best Practices Badge. It was created to identify those best practices. And here I should note that we are focusing on the production of open source software. There's actually other projects that work on good practices for receiving open source software. We're looking at what should projects do to produce good software. And they're based on the practices of well-run open source software projects. We looked at a number of different projects. Hey, what are you doing? And so on. The goal is to increase the likelihood of better quality, better security, and frankly, better sustainment as also. And our criteria are designed for any open source software project. We'll explain how we do that in a moment. software projects. Therefore, systems that only work for a few really don't apply. That said, self-certification has its disadvantages. How do we deal with people who lie, for example? Well, we've actually mitigated some of those problems with various approaches. First of all, we do have some automation, and at least in some cases where we can tell that someone is not telling the truth, we override their responses and say, no, that's not true. We require public display of the answers, and this allows public criticism. We do spot checks, and we can actually override answers if they're false. So who created and runs the badging project? Well, fundamentally, the Linux Foundation is what has supported, developed, and kept this going. You can see the goal of the Linux Foundation. Fundamentally, if you're not familiar with the Linux Foundation, which is actually my employer, they're a nonprofit. And lots of projects that you've probably heard of or indirectly use are part of the Linux Foundation. So the Linux kernel, of course, the JS Foundation, which supports a number of very important JavaScript packages, Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which includes Kubernetes, but in fact there's a lot of other kinds of projects. The R Consortium, Aleph Energy, Aleph Public Health, so there's a number of different foundations projects within it. Historically, the Core Infrastructure Initiative, CII, was organized by the LF to basically fund and support critical elements. And so this means that the badging project is itself an open source project that was originally created by the CII, and yes, we do get our own badge. Because I'm a big believer in not being hypocritical. Now in 2020, the badging project transitioned to the newer Open Source Security Foundation. The CII actually technically no longer exists, but it was created by the CII, which is why it has that name. I was actually talking to some folks just before the conference here. This may actually get renamed to become the OpenSSF Best Practices Badge or something like that. We're in discussion. So just be aware that there may be a name change, but it's still the same project. And there's every intention to keep going. So if you went to the badge applications homepage, this is what it would look like. You just go to the front page of it, and in fact, if you are running or involved with an open source software project, please just go to that website, bestpractices.coreinfrastructure.org. You can push in that big green button, get your badge now, and start the process. A number of open source software projects have already gotten involved and have in fact earned a best practices badge. Here's just a few of them. This is by no means all, but here's a few of them anywhere, and they represent quite a variety. The Linux kernel, of course, is an operating system kernel. GitLab is hosting a forge, basically. You got Kubernetes, Node.js, curl, Blender. OWASP, Zap. So you've got a real variety of projects that have earned an open source software, have earned a best practices badge. And it turns out that the CII best practices badge are increasingly getting adopted. So the general availability of it was in May 2016, and as of now, and this graph here shows all the participating projects. We now have over 4,100 participating projects. It's been relatively linear growth. I honestly don't understand that. I would expect there to be more spikes, but that's what's really happening. Because in fact, we do track that sort of stuff. If you start looking at the projects with non-trivial progress, we now have over 640 projects which have earned at least the passing level of the badge. So that's really quite substantial. That's a number of different projects that have managed to achieve that, and that's quite an achievement. So let me talk briefly about badge levels. There's actually 3 badge levels: passing, silver, and gold. To earn the higher level, you have to meet the previous level. Let me focus briefly on the passing badge. don't care. We're not interested. We're interested in criteria that have proven themselves in practice. And so we went out and tried to identify those practices. And in fact, we ended up with 66 criteria that could be grouped into those 6 groups. The basics, change control, reporting quality, security, analysis. Silver is harder. You first have to achieve, passing to achieve silver, and there's other criteria that are harder, but are still possible for a project that's fundamentally led by a single person, and mostly as a single person involved. Gold is where we have additional criteria that are really helpful, and users would love to see those, but they require, for example, they're harder, in particular, some require 2-person, more than one developer. So, for example, something called the bus factor. If any one person dies or is incapacitated in some other way, can the project just easily keep going? You institute 2-person reviews. These are good from the user's point of view, but obviously require multiple developers. I'm not going to go through every single one of the criteria, but I do want to give you an idea of what we were trying to achieve with the criteria. Fundamentally, we wanted the criteria to be reasonable. So you could call these meta-criteria, the criteria on the criteria. I'm going to talk through these quickly. We believe all criteria meet these. They need to be relevant, attainable by a typical project, clear. We were interested very much in security-related criteria, but a project that can't sustain itself or is very low quality is not going to be secure either. So while we were really interested in security, we also included criteria involving sustainment or quality because those are necessary for long-term security. We were interested in criteria that had the consensus of developers and users. We went and interacted with a number of open source projects. We built on existing work. I'll do a quick call out to Carl Vogel's producing open source software book. And we were very interested in not being hypocritical. We worked to get a badge ourselves. And we did, as I mentioned, work with several projects to test their validity. Here are things we don't do. We do not require any particular technology or product or service. We don't require any programming language. We do not forbid any programming language. Now, we do sometimes include tips saying, hey, this is a common way to do it. We don't have to do things in that particular way, but we try to help. There's one exception you could say for the specific technology. We do expect that every project will have a web page using TLS, in other words, HTTPS://. If you're hosted on GitHub or GitLab, you're automatically going to get that. But there needs to be some ways that users can quickly find and learn about the project. It never requires proprietary software or services. You may use them, that's fine. But our criteria don't require it. Doesn't cost anything. We do not take over projects. People keep their projects. These are just the criteria that we hope your project will decide to meet. And we don't require meeting everything immediately. It is true, some projects were run very well from the beginning. They tried to get a badge. In fact, they found out they were doing everything. Well, great, congratulations. That means that you know that, and everyone else knows that. Most projects, however, when they try for a badge, they find that there's some things missing, and then they gradually work to fix those issues. And that's fine, that's completely expected. So here's a few sample criteria, and I believe that they're all reasonable. Things like the website must succinctly describe what the software does, what problem does it solve. It's still remarkable how many projects don't tell anyone what are they trying to accomplish. Well, how can anyone know whether or not we'll meet their needs, whether or not it's secure, because we don't even know what it's supposed to do. The project must use at least one automated test suite. That could be maintained separately, that's fine, but there needs to be an automated test suite. If you don't have a test suite, then it's very, very easy to make changes that break it. You need to use at least one static code analysis tool. If there's at least one FLOSS tool that does this. Static code analysis tools do not find everything, and just because they complain about something doesn't necessarily mean it's a security vulnerability. Nevertheless, they are extremely helpful in finding problems that a human might miss. The project sites have to support HTTPS because we want to make sure that people get to the right site and that they can't be subverted along the way. Project must publish the process for reporting vulnerabilities on the project website. This is probably the criterion, this is the criterion that's most missed. Tell everyone how to report vulnerabilities. It's available in a variety of languages. I'm obviously speaking in English, but we have a wonderful French translation. We also have translations for Chinese, German, Japanese, Russian. If you're interested in helping with translations, those or others, please come talk to me. We'd love to know about it. Now, once you have identified the criteria, you need to score it. So, to get a badge, you must meet all the must and must not criteria. All the shoulds must either be met or have a justification, and you need to at least consider the suggested ones. Okay, and here's some other things I've already mentioned. There's a lot of automation. Some larger projects like the Open Network Automation Platform and CNCF require badging. CNCF, for example, requires getting at least a passing badge to graduate. Lots of people have said that they've improved their projects. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to not go through all these. But for example, OWASP, ZAP worked to get a badge, and they said, "Wow, this forced us to significantly improve their automated testing," and they were glad of it. I'm going to skip this for lack of time. So what are my conclusions? If you're involved in an open source software project, please get a badge. You don't need to do everything once, just start. Questions, file an issue, send email, whatever, love to hear from you. We all want to help you. Prefer using open source software for projects that are using best practices. And the best practices badge can help people figure that out. If you think that the criteria need additions or refinements, or you might be willing to help in translations to natural languages, please let us know. We are ourselves an open source project. And more information there. And with that, we have a little time for questions. Please, a question or two.
Thanks, David. So if you have questions, please stand up and use one of the mic. While you're thinking about your next questions, I have one for you, David. So since you're director of open source supply chain security at the Linux Foundation, so how is CII best practices badge integrated in the SCA, so in the security of the supply chain, with other things that OpenSSF is doing?
How does this integrate with SCA? Well, the OpenSSF, of course, is doing a large number of things. It's interested in supply chains and just in general in security. So the CII Best Practices badge is actually part of the OpenSSF Best Practices Working Group, where there's a number of different projects involved in various kinds of best practices. Unfortunately, there's not enough time to fully answer your question, but I'll note that one thing that we do is the Best Practices badge makes it very easy to query and say, hey, I have this particular project. Does it have a best practices badge? So for example, it's quite possible to have something called an SBOM, a software bill of material, to list all the components within a larger system. And then you can do things like query and ask, I see this component, does it have a best practices badge? And you could also look and say, hey, does that vulnerability nothing? So we intentionally make it very easy to start with a list of here are the components either I'm thinking of using or I am currently using or system I'm using includes, and then figure out which ones have met the best practices badge, or at least on their way. Any other questions?
So thanks for this. I think we don't have time for more questions. Thanks a bunch, David, for joining us today. And I'm sure the conversation will continue online. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please contact me.